So in this segment, we're going to be doing an introduction to RStudio. As part of that, we're going to start by talking about what RStudio actually is, which is called an Integrated Development Environment, or IDE. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between a data scientist and a developer, because this is very relevant to the conversation about R. Finally, we'll discuss features of RStudio, followed by a guided tour of RStudio itself. So an integrated development environment is a software application that provides comprehensive facilities to computer programmers for software development. An IDE normally consists of a source code editor, build automation tools, and a debugger. And a great example of an IDE, if you're familiar with this one, is Visual Studio. It's very popular, supports many different languages, and it's a very powerful development environment. Before we get into discussing RStudio specifically, I want to discuss the difference between a data scientist versus a developer, because I see there's a lot of confusion in this, especially in the developer community. So let's talk about that. A data scientist is, at the end of the day, an analyst who's trying to get business insights. Typically, they are a statistician with an advanced degree, often a PhD in statistics. They're focused on the data analysis and obtaining insights. And they may not really even be that interested in automating the end result. Very often, they're involved in research projects, trying to find the cause of cancer maybe, or trying to discover new insights into environmental issues, etc. And often they're not really repeatable, and there's a lot of manual interaction needed to get to the end result. Think of kind of medical studies where you're giving pharmaceuticals to a patient and things. Not something you're definitely going to automate, and the data may be even too small. So a data scientist orientation is a bit different from a developer whose goal really is to automate. That's what they do. That's what developers have always done. And so at the end of the day, typically a developer has a set of requirements, and they're pretty well defined. And admittedly, sometimes you get requirements on a napkin, but at the end of the day, before you implement, you have to define what those requirements are. And the developer is completely focused on this automation thing. So there's a really different perspective between these two roles. So talking now a little about RStudio. RStudio has advanced text editing support specifically designed for R. It has integration with the Comprehensive R Archive Network, CRAN. It's very customizable to the way you work, so you can make changes and change the colors and all kinds of good things to make it the way you like to work. There's tools like a debugger and profiler to help you in your development process. Support for extensions to R like Shiny for web applications, or dplyr, or installing packages, etc. So there's a lot of great features there that are integrated with R. So it's not just that you can load the packages, but it also has things that will make it easier to use those packages. And finally, as I was just discussing, it's really designed for the data scientist. It has a lot of great tools. It is definitely good for developers, but the idea throughout RStudio seems to really be, let's get at what's going on in the data, less than about let's turn it into a scheduled job. So let's do a little tour of RStudio, and maybe we can get a better idea of what I mean by this. So I'm going to start up RStudio. In my case, I've got it on the taskbar, but it's under RStudio in your program manager. When we first get in, we can see that we have the IDE, but there's no script. Very often, if you left the script in, it will show it with the script editor. And I did this intentionally so that we could see, well, what do you do here? Where's the script window? Where do I type in my scripts? So the way I can create a script is by hitting the plus sign or go to the File menu. So I'm going to use the File menu, and I'm going to say RScript. And it creates a nice little editor for me. And I'll now create it the other way with the toolbar and say RScript again. And it just creates another tab. So I can have multiple scripts being edited at the same time. So this first left upper quadrant is the text editor. And I have to use these location terms a little loosely because you can rearrange this any way you like to work. But I'm going to work from what I have set up here. And let's say I want to start a script, and I'll start with a comment saying, this is a script. And I want to set up something. Maybe I want to create a variable, so I'll create some sort of variable called my data. And I'm going to set it equal to, and I know there's a data set built into R. And notice that in the editor, we're getting what Microsoft would call IntelliSense, but it's code completion. So I can now say, gee, I'm accessing something called the iris dataset, which is in memory. And I have the options of picking some different things. But I just want to get the whole dataset itself. So I'm going to hit enter and not select anything there. And then I want to display the data. So I'm going to write it on its own. And I can save this or I can leave it. Now notice it says in the tab it's untitled. That means it's not saved. It gives it a sort of a default name for now. Now if I want to run this, I have a couple of options that are available. One is I can select lines of code and then execute just those lines. And that's my favorite way to do it, be honest, because I'm very often, and you're going to find this I think if you're new to R, it's easy to kind of work through pieces and make sure they work. So typically I would do a lot of editing with pieces of the code being executed to make sure each one's working before I move on. So I'm selecting just the first line of executable code. The other one's a comment, not really anything to run. And I'm going to pick this little arrow, little box with an arrow, and it says run. And that means run. It says right there, highlights, run the current selection. And you can also notice, say, do Control Enter. So it's often telling you what the keyboard combination could be instead of doing the menu. So I'm going to click it. And notice that the line came out in the console. That's what it does. So it's going to submit anything I run is going to be executed in the console. Nothing to really see though because it's a statement that doesn't have any output. But if I now take the variable I created and do the run again, it gives me the data set back. So that shows what happens if I do one at a time. So let's go ahead and save this. And I'm just going to call it my script. Say 1, just to give it a name. And now that it has a name, I can go over to the source, and I have two options when I do source. I can say source, or I can say source with echo. Source without echo is really meant for more background execution. You don't need all this output. But we're editing now, so if I'm going to run source, I'm going to run it interactively. And to show you what I did, now I'm going to go to the console because it kind of flashed quickly. If I hit Control L, that clears the console. These options can also be found in the edit menu, and you can see different things like clear console right here, Control L. So I just want to clear it so that when I do the source, you can see that it ran the program. So that's the main thing about the console. It will submit it. And that's because it was done with echo. If you're going to run source, if you're in the IDE, chances are you want to do it that way. But let's try it without echo. And let me, again, Control L just to make sure it's visible what we're doing. And if I do it without echo, it shows you the line that's running it, and that's it. And it's an important thing I'll pick up also there. Notice the line. This is something very common. RStudio does not reinvent the R language, and almost everything in RStudio already has a command equivalent in R. So what RStudio is really doing is just giving you a button so you don't have to remember the syntax, which I happen to like because I forget the syntax all the time. So rather than Googling things, you can now just use buttons, but you can do it directly. So this source statement, notice it's a function, and it's passing in the full path with the name of the script. That's important because what it means is it's actually not running what you're seeing in the console per se. It's actually looking for the file you saved and executing that. And you don't have to run, if you use the source, you don't have to run what's in the editor. It could be anything. So that's an important thing in that. And in this case, notice that we're not using the echo. So that's the main difference I want to really focus on, just realizing echo and not. I typically, again, I use a lot of segment running, and sourcing is something I would do when I know it's already there. You can call functions and things separate and all those things. So just to be aware of that. And there are things here too, like you have find and replace, so you can do global replaces and things, typical editing functions. And this also is kind of the edit menu within the toolbar. So the toolbar has everything kind of right there. And just other things. This is really has to do with knitter and things and some other functions which are more advanced. So there's some advanced functions we probably won't be getting to in this presentation, but there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So now let's shift our attention for a moment down to the console. And what I want to kind of reinforce with the console, and by the way, while I'm thinking of it, you can enlarge any screen with these little buttons. So it's kind of handy if you want to do that. What I want to focus on in the console though is this is really your interactive place that you're not going to really want to ignore because it's very useful, especially for debugging or looking into things. But one of the things, for instance, I can do in the console, I could just say ls, and it lists basically things in memory and stuff like that, things that are available. So it's handy. Again, Control L just to clear this. I can type in direct things like 5 plus 5. So it's meant to be interactive. And finally, where it's really handy is, here's a question. What if we wanted to see what's in my data? Let's assume we're running a program and it's created different variables, created different objects. We want to look at it and see, can I look into it? Like, did it get a value? Is that the problem? So again, the debugging kind of emphasis here. but I can just type in my data and it displays it. I can also do something kind of neat. I can say summary, my data, and this is an R function. So notice I can do this. I can actually say summary and get a little analysis, which shows things like the min, max, medium. It does quartiles. It's very powerful. It's giving me a nice summary statistics for each column. So again, think data scientist, I may be playing with data. I don't necessarily want to put the summary statement in my script. But I might like to say, gee, what is this data looking like? Let me analyze this a little bit. Let me play with it. So the console is very useful for that. And so you're going to, as a data scientist, I think you will bounce between both and only take what you really need to do in the script. Very likely you'll probably put commented outlines in the script that you can then run if you need to. It's kind of what I do. But the console is very useful for just kind of an alternate way of looking into what's going on. All right, so let's go to the upper right-hand panel for a minute, the upper right quadrant. We can see we have a lot of stuff in our environment. And we noticed when we did the ls command, we got to see a lot of this. But what's really a handy thing is that I can do something like, these here, like delay, for instance. I can click on this and it gives you what's called a structure. str will give you the equivalent of this, which gives you the sort of structure of the object. In this case, a data frame. And if I were to open it like this, I get a nice little viewable grid, which is sortable. I can do filters. So it's got a lot of nice features. So it's, again, it's a tool built into RStudio, which allows me to kind of get better insights into the data. And again, that's really how you're going to probably be working in most cases. Now I want to call your attention to the console. Where did this come from? The answer is when I clicked on that button to see the data as a grid, it actually equates to an R command. So this is not something RStudio created. It's something RStudio is leveraging. And I can just as easily say view, and I'll pick something else, the built-in data set, for instance, iris. And iris comes up, which is just some information about flowers, which is often used for sort of training and stuff. But notice how you can do that. And also a nice little thing I can do, I can type in edit, iris, let me get the spelling right, and I get kind of a little spreadsheet for all practical purposes, very similar, like a very simple Excel spreadsheet kind of thing. But I could actually edit things in it and save it back, and it will replace it in memory. So it can be handy. Just a thing. But the interesting thing is, again, that's an R command. And so most things, if not everything, within RStudio can be done through our statements directly. So there's no magic really going on. RStudio just does a great job of kind of making it easy for you to do it without having to think about all these statements. All right, so I want to take a quick look at the History tab. And we can see here, basically what the History tab does, as I mentioned before, R has this concept of a session. And so the data related to a session is retained. And you can clear it out, or you can save it to file names. And you can say, I want to say the state of this session. And it will save all the objects in memory and things like that and bring them back. So when I exit, it'll ask you, and it's an option to set as a default, to save the last session memory. And it will do that. And next time you come in, it just restores it. And what this is showing is all of the statements that have executed since my session began. And this goes back, obviously, it's keeping a lot of my history of whatever I've done. So yeah, so that's all in there, and you can see my latest commands at the bottom. Finally, I'm going to now move down to the lower right-hand quadrant, which we're getting deeper into our RStudio coverage. And we have a nice little tab here. This is really a nifty idea for an IDE. It's similar to if you use Visual Studio, when you have solutions, you can navigate to files and things. But this is a direct window into the file system. And I can navigate to programs I want, and if I click on a given program, it just loads it in the editor to the left. So again, it's really handy that I can just navigate around like that. And it allows me, if you notice in the toolbar, I can say delete, rename, etc. I have some options here to move and things. I can even do set and go to working directories. So the idea within RStudio and our development in general is it's pointing to a default location on the file system for when you reference files and things. And you can change where that's looking. And finally, if I go over here, a really handy thing is if I hit the little ellipsis, I can kind of find a nice little easy navigation window to move around my file system and set myself at a new location. So it's kind of like in Star Trek, beaming to a new location, a little easier to get around. So again, nice thing. I tend to be old school, so I still tend to go to the file menu and do things, but this is certainly a great option. Plots, if we had drawn any graphics, would show up in the plots window. And packages is now I want to be careful here to explain. These are packages which are already installed on your system, but are not currently loaded into memory. Okay, so what I'm going to do as we look through here, maybe I want to bring one into memory. I'll use plyr, for instance. It's kind of a nifty package. And again, notice what it did. It used an R command to the right. It just generated it for me. And what it did is it brought that into memory. And if I want to get rid of it, oh, I don't need that anymore. I can do that, and it gets rid of it out of memory. Now, in scripts, you're typically going to put the library references, what packages you want to use in your script. But it's a very handy thing to have that, because if you're interactively working, it might be just, oh yeah, I need that, click, and you get it in. You also have a help window. So if I ask for help, this was apparently the last thing I was inquiring about, a data set. It comes up in the help window, and you can expand that, or you can have help go into the browser, etc. And some things will go into the viewer window for viewing. And finally, let's take a little browse around the file menu a little bit. So we've seen the file menu, new file and stuff. You can do projects, all kinds of things related, importing data sets, lots of good things. I encourage you to explore these things. The edit menu tends to be more about editing your scripts. The code window gives you all kinds of special features for manipulating code and doing things with it. The view allows you to position windows, what do you want to see showing, things like that. So kind of customize the way it looks and feels in the environment. You got plots to manage plots, and your session, I mentioned session memory, etc. Build. The thing I want to really jump to though is tools. And there's two things I want to call out your attention to. One is global options, and the other is installing packages. So let's take a look at global options first. And what this is this is where we can customize the RStudio environment to work the way we like to work. So there's all kinds of things. I can have multiple versions of R, if you notice here, to be changing to. I can look at code, and here's how code will be implemented and what saving options I want and code completion, etc. I can go to appearance and customize fonts and colors. Lots of things here. Packages, all kinds of good stuff. I can integrate with VSN or my source code control system, etc. So there's a lot of features within that. Over time, I would encourage you to look at that and figure out what makes sense for you, assuming you choose to stay with RStudio. Finally, I want to go into install packages. Now we've seen there's many ways to get to this, and you can even do it through an R command, install packages. But I do like this feature because, one, notice it has the install dependencies options checked off. And that means that if you want to get a package and install it, it will look in that package and find anything that package depends on, in other words, other packages, and get those too. So you're not at risk of finding, oh, you installed that, but gee, you forgot to get this and the other thing, and now your script's not working. Now if I start typing, I get a little IntelliSense, and I can find the package I want, and then just say install. Now I'm not going to do that right here because I don't want to be waiting 20 minutes for this to install, but I would do that, and it will automatically install the package, and it's ready to go. Now installing the package is not the same as getting it referenceable in memory. It's not bringing it into memory, it's putting it on your machine. So it's downloading it from CRAN and putting it on your machine. And I have to say, my own experience with this is it's amazingly seamless and easy, because CRAN really is just the guardians of R. You don't have to worry about other sites too much. There are some sort of open source shareable libraries from users that are on GitHub, and that's great. But most of what you're going to need, you can get right from CRAN. So I can say install, and I'd get it. And then I just have to use the library statement in my code, which we'll see later, to actually use the package. All right, so I'm going to cancel out of there and go back to my slideshow. And I think we've covered a lot. We've covered about a lot of things like what is an integrated development environment. And we talked a little bit about the difference between a data scientist and a developer. And we noted that an IDE is really targeted more for a developer as a rule. It's automating things. It's helping you write programs. But we also noticed that data scientists are not really about automation. Their focus tends to be more analysis and insights. Then we looked at RStudio, and we talked about the features of RStudio, which was followed by a guided tour. And I'm not going to go through the entire guided tour again, but I'm going to call out a couple of key features which are important to know about and that we did cover, like creating a new script, which we can do from file menu and other places, but that's where we really talked about, all the little button on the toolbar with the plus sign. We talked about using the object viewer, which is just cool and nifty to use. We talked about how to execute code, and we really looked at two modes. One is running selected code, what you highlight in the editor, and the other is running the file, which is called sourcing, and the options of echoing back what's being sourced or not. We discussed file navigation. How do we load scripts? And the fact that the Files tab in the lower right-hand corner is really handy, and we can just click on scripts and load them. And we talked about some options which are handy off the Tools menu. One is setting environment configuration settings, and the other is how to install packages through that menu. In global options, we can see that we have a lot of different settings, and we reviewed some of these. There's way too many to cover in a session here, but one of those things I encourage you to explore and play with. A lot of flexibility there. And we looked a little bit at installing packages. From the Tools menu, we can say install packages. And it has a sort of IntelliSense built in, so it's actually querying CRAN and saying these are the things CRAN's got available. And you can then pick what you want. And you can't see it's covered by the drop-down, but there's a Install Dependencies checkbox, which is by default turned on. I recommend you leave it because you don't want to install partially what you need. So wrapping up, we talked about why RStudio. And there's a slight bias towards the data scientist in this because R is about statistics. It's about data and insights, more than it is really programming and automation. And so we did do a slight favoritism that way. Also, RStudio is by far the most popular IDE available, and it's open source and free. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention there are other options. I think the best alternate option would be RTools for Visual Studio, which is Visual Studio with extensions specifically added supporting R. And I have a blog, which you can see there, www.sequelify-com, which you can see, and it's a very comprehensive comparison between RStudio and Visual Studio for R. Both are very good, but Visual Studio, being Visual Studio, is really targeted towards automation and development. And in particular, where I would highly recommend people look at that is if you're using SQL Server's R integration with R Server, which is SQL Server 2016 features. They're really doing a lot to extend Visual Studio to support testing and deployment of that kind of functionality. So the operationalizing type side of things is really something Visual Studio I think is better at and is going to get better and better at. But overall, I'm still leaning towards RStudio, and I think it's going to work out very well for this class, and we'll need to know it. Eclipse is another option, very popular in the Linux world. And finally, the R console I've been very harsh on. I just like why not go to RStudio is kind of my thinking. But I shouldn't be so hard on it because it isn't a bad place to start, and you certainly can do your basic scripting and type the console and learn a lot about R. I think it's fair to say it's not the place you want to be if you're really going to be professionally using R, but it's not a bad place to start for testing. Now, having said all that, we are going to be using RStudio going forward. You're going to learn more things. A lot of the things I've already covered, you're going to see again, and I look forward to talking to you further.